Okay. Thanks, Karina. Well, welcome. I am Dr. Miaken Zeigler. My practice is Zeigler Chiropractic. I'm just in the Golden Triangle. For anybody who is showing up who is a part of the Pure Life community, it is great to have you on here. We are planning on merging our practice and we'll be in the new space in January under Monarch Family Chiropractic. And a big part of our practice is to really support your education. To be a more healthy, more vitalistic, I guess, person, you need to make different choices. And every choice you make, if this is a spectrum of health and disease, every choice you make will either put you over towards health or put you towards disease. And if we can help support your education and help hold you accountable to doing the things that are most right for you to create health, then we feel like we are doing a better job in healthcare to serve you. And so I appreciate you being here on this workshop tonight, because not everyone shows up on a Tuesday night to commit to 30 minutes of hopefully learning something that they can take away to gain better perspective, but also gain some health. So tonight, headaches, I think, are a vital and important topic, because when you look at headaches, I mean, I looked at the stats today. According to the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Strokes, they determined that headaches are the most common form of pain that Americans experience. And it is a major reason for days missed at work, days missed at school, as well as visits to the doctor. And I like to always make sure that if you're experiencing headaches, a lot of times people think to experience a chronic condition, it needs to be around for years, when in fact, chronic is defined as something that is 3 months or longer, okay? And so if you have or experience headaches, whether it's once a week, that's a lot, because that's 52 headaches in a year. Once a month is still considered abnormal. Headaches, there's a reason that you get headaches. And when we look at, your health and your condition, if you experience headaches through a chiropractic lens, we evaluate you a little bit differently. And so when you look at the standard of care with our medical counterparts, typically they're looking at pain medications, even injections, as a way to address headaches. And that is just a Band-Aid, right? And so if a Band-Aid is used, and it's used for years and decades, when we look at some of the research, we can see those long-term health effects if that's how we're addressing it. So we want to dive into what is the root cause of the headache and how can we support you using alternative methods to create health. And when you create health, guess what? Your symptoms go away. So let's first start with, what is a headache? And a headache simply is an energy crisis to the brain, okay? And I'll get into this in more detail, but it's an energy crisis to the brain. So I want you to think about that in terms of neurological input, so lack of appropriate neurological input to the brain, or lack of appropriate vascular blood flow to the brain, right? So your brain, when you consider the amount of blood flow that goes into the brain, it's a ton of blood flow, ton of vasculature for a pretty small space or pretty small organ in terms of, I guess, surface area. And so it's an energy crisis to the brain if you're not getting appropriate neurological input, we'll get into that, or appropriate vascular input, because your brain needs to be good blood supply, good nourishment. So a headache is really a stressed brain. And if your brain cells are in energy crisis, it could lead to a degenerative stress to the brain, okay? And we'll see that when we look at a couple pieces of research. So before I go there, I first want to, again, give you the lens in which chiropractors are really viewing the body in terms of headache, okay? Because we work with the brain. We work with the nervous system. So when I talk about the neurological component, this is going to give you the lens. So the brain was the first organ to form in utero. From the brain came every cell, organ, tissue, gland in the body, and the brain was in control of its development, in control of its function from day one till last day of life. It is the only thing fully encased in bone. So for us as chiropractors, we want to assess how is your brain and nervous system functioning. That's why we go to the spine. Now, the way the brain gets its information is through all of the sensory input from our environment, right? What we see, what we taste, what we feel, what we hear. And then we've got this sixth sense, which is called your proprioception. It's your brain's ability to see where you are in space, right? If I put my arm behind, my head, I know it's back there, not because I see it or feel it or taste it. It's because I just know. So your brain gets all this sensory input in, it can process, and it responds to its environment based on sensory input. So how we process and how we express ourselves is based on all the sensory input. So when we look at, if you're experiencing headaches, we're looking at what's going on in the upper cervical spine, and really the neck, that could impact that stress or those nerves that are going into the head, the face, the mouth, the jaw, the sinuses. And if there's any neurological component, we call it a subluxation, that's putting stress on a nervous system and altering that information in, it could create a crisis to the brain, right? And we have a stressed brain. We'll get into the vasculature in just a second here. But again, the neurological component can impact the vascular component. So a lot of times we see that it can be a combination of neurological and vascular. So let's dive into understanding types of headaches. And I want you to think about headaches as there's intracranial, okay? So there's really inside the head, and then there's extracranial outside the head that can contribute to somebody experiencing a headache or an energy crisis to the brain. And a major cause of, or a major type of headache that is intracranial is called a migraine. Okay, typically a migraine is one side of the head, and it's coupled with changes of vision, okay? And you can have an increased sensitivity to sound or light. Now, if there's a vision change, we typically call it an aura, okay? Now, when we look at headaches, we're really looking at three components of stress: the physical stress, the emotional stress, and the chemical stress. Okay, so if you are somebody who experiences headaches, specifically migraines, as I'm going through this list, I want you to think about, what is going on in your world that could be contributing to your headaches. Okay, so typically, if we look at the physical component, there's a dysfunction in the brainstem. Okay, the brainstem still located within that vertebral canal of C1. That's why C1 is so important. Brainstem is where all of proprioception takes place. So again, you can have major impact due to an injury or past illness that could be the catalyst or the root cause of why we see migraines show up. So if there's anything going on at the brainstem, okay, posturally, if you ever see yourself showing a rotation right to left and just how you're posturally standing, sitting, or carrying yourself, typically most rotation or movement happens in that plane in the upper cervical spine. So we see C1 subluxation showing up. So if you have a posture rotation just in how you're sitting, typically go upper cervical spine. And if you're not experiencing headaches or migraines, if it's there long enough, we could see that show up, down the road. Now, there's also an eye component to it. So if there's any eye strain due to high amounts of light exposure, that can cause a headache or migraine. Now, if you've got an astigmatism, or you have a lazy eye, or you have eye muscles that aren't working in synergy, that could contribute to a migraine. So sometimes those need to be corrected with glasses. Okay? Poor posture can contribute to a migraine, right? If we've got a change in curve, if you've got degeneration going on through a cervical spine, you got a forward head movement, your head's out here. That places a lot of stress on a spine, but more than that, places a lot of stress on a brain, and again, puts the brain in energy crisis. Okay. Other health conditions that affect the neck or spine, including anything with PMJ. And then high levels of inflammation, which affect nerves in the brain and the blood vessels. So we can see inflammation showing up due to a physical trauma, right? We could have concussions from impacts due to sports or a motor vehicle accident or a sprain strain, a whiplash type scenario. That could be a cause of why we see an intracranial headache like a migraine show up. Now, I talked about chemical stress. There can be a chemical or nutritional stress related to you experiencing a migraine, okay? That last point, we talked about high levels of inflammation can affect the nerves to the brain and the blood vessels, okay? So poor diet. If we are eating the standard American diet, which is high in processed sugars, high in processed seed oils, high fructose corn syrup, and corn, soy, genetically modified foods. If we are eating and consuming fast food, that is an inflammatory diet. That is nutrition that your body needs to use to, as the building blocks at the cellular level. So if you have highly inflammatory foods, couple that with poor nutrition, causing some deficiencies, that can show up in terms of inflammation to brain and blood vessels, and that could contribute to why you may have a migraine, okay? Now, changes in neurotransmitter levels, including serotonin and high levels of stress hormones like cortisol, that can also contribute to why we might see somebody present with a migraine. Now, going back to the brain, the neurological component, if you constantly feel like you are in a stress state, you are in a fight or flight because you need to protect yourself and you need to survive, right? Back in the day when we were cavemen, right, we had to physically survive our environment to protect, ourselves from saber-toothed lions. We don't have that these days, but our body still neurologically goes into that fight or flight stage. So if we are in a constant stress state and we are patterned to be in that, what's called sympathetic, where that stress hormone cortisol is constantly being pumped into the blood, which causes an adrenaline rush, causes eyes to be dilated, causes our muscles to be fired up to protect ourselves, that can contribute to a migraine, right? We can see hormonal changes. And again, we do mess with our hormones when we start giving girls the pill, right? When we start changing their cycles at a very early age. We can see hormone changes with many major life event hormonal changes when it comes around menopause. Typically, we see migraines affect more women than men. So anytime hormonal changes happen, that can contribute to a migraine. Dehydration. A lot of times people say, man, I'm getting a headache. I know I'm dehydrated, right? So if we're not drinking enough water, that can contribute to a migraine. And then we also have reactions to medications. Side effect can be headaches. And then we also see if you have chronic infection, low level infection that you don't necessarily know is there, that can contribute to a migraine. So there's lots of components to think about when it comes to headaches. And I like to categorize it, physical, chemical, next we'll get into emotional. So you can start to pinpoint what are my triggers and how can I start supporting a healthier, more lifestyle that creates health and take some of these pieces out or add some pieces in. So emotional stress. We have the chronic stress piece. If you're feeling overly anxious, if you're feeling busy or rushed, chronically nervous, that's a chronic stress piece that feeds into that loop of sympathetic state, stress, fight or flight state. Again, emotions and how we experience the world can cause some hormonal changes. We can see dehydration. Lack of sleep can show up. And I know some of these are repeats, but they all blend together. Reactions to medications. And then we do see the family history of the genetic susceptibility. And let me just put a quick pause there, because there's no gene for migraine. There is no gene for headache. Okay, there's no gene coding that says, oh, this shows up, you have the gene for headache. But we see headaches or migraines run in families. And that's because there's a big portion of genetics that's called epigenetics, which is your lifestyle choices, your behaviors, your actions, the environmental component that can turn genes on or off to create a sequencing that shows up as a migraine or a headache. So kids tend to have the same belief systems, the same behaviors, the same actions. They eat the similar foods as their parents, just like their parents did with your grandparents, right? So we tend to pass on these genetic sequencing due to our lifestyle that turns on our susceptibility to migraines, right? And I love that conversation because that allows us to take an empowering role. We can change it, right? And how do we change that? Through making different choices, through removing things or adding things into our life, and really starting to address some of these underlying concerns and issues versus doing what the standard of care typically does, which is, really do some pain management of addressing symptoms alone, right? So let's get into some of these, because these are concerning. I want you to think about chronic migraines, okay? Chronic, anything that lasts 3 months or longer, but I want you to think about if this is going on for years and decades. This is out of Harvard Health Publishing, Harvard Medical School. Migraines, can dementia, stroke, or heart attack be next with migraines? This is what they found. After increased blood pressure, right? If you have high blood pressure, after that, migraine with an aura, so you see that vision change, is the second strongest single contributing risk factor for heart attacks and strokes. Wow. What's the number one leading cause of death in our country? Heart disease. What's the first symptom? Heart attacks, right? So if we are a symptom-based society and we don't know to address heart disease until we have the heart attack, which kills most people, then that's a problem. But guess what? If we have migraines or headaches, and those have been, something that's been a part of our life that we've just been addressing through some pain management, that's a sign and symptom that something needs to change, right? So continue. The results show that migraine with aura increased the risk of white matter brain lesions by 68%. Brain lesions, that's dementia. Lesions could be MS, right? Alzheimer's. And migraine with no aura increased by the risk of 34%. And the risk for infarct-like abnormalities, that's like a minor stroke or micro stroke, increased by 44% for those with migraine with aura compared to those without. So that's where I want you to start thinking about. This is a bigger issue. This is why America has a challenge with chronic disease, because we have been addressing for a long time just the symptom. But the symptom is your brain's way of saying, hey, there's something going on. I need some help here, right? It's a way for you to do some investigative work to say, what is my body telling me? How can I change things up? Because if we only address the symptom with pain medications or management of symptoms, whether it's injections, whether it's at some point becoming a surgical type or more aggressive type response to treatment, and we're not creating health, we're not taking out the pieces that are really contributing to it, because we went through all of these, one or multiple of these could be contributing to you experiencing a headache or migraine on a regular basis. If we're not addressing that, and that continues over time, we're talking about dementia, stroke, and heart attack, right? If that doesn't stop you in your tracks, well, it should stop you in your tracks. It does me, right? Because too often when something becomes, prevalent or more common in our life, we think it's normal, but having a headache is not normal, okay? So that's really the big thing that I want you to get from here. This is out of Multiple Sclerosis Society. I'll get it to you, but they found that there's an increased risk of multiple sclerosis among women with migraines, and they studied nurses. They studied 68,000 women. And they said history of migraine was associated with an increased risk of multiple sclerosis. Again, going back to lesions in the brain, that is multiple sclerosis, right? So, I mean, these are pretty heavy conditions. These are pretty heavy diagnoses. And it didn't start there, right? None of these chronic diseases started there. In fact, they started years and decades ago. So that's where I go back to, let me check the time. I go back to you choosing preventative healthcare. You choosing to take care of your body now. Everything you do to create health has a cumulative effect. So the fact that you are in your chiropractic care and you're showing up multiple times a week, you're showing up weekly, and you're doing that for years, that builds health. And that's amazing, right? That literally change your trajectory. So again, when you get your chiropractic adjustments, that's removing stress and interference to a brain and nervous system. That's shifting your body out of your brain out of crisis. That's allowing your brain to better process your environment appropriately. That's your brain being better able to handle, the chronic stress that you find yourself in because you're working, you're a parent, you're trying to manage work-life balance as well as, live this thing we call life, right? That's where, I really appreciate and value, anytime we have a chiropractic patient or patient advocate who is showing up consistently for their care, because you're literally changing how your brain responds to your world. So I got really excited and I wasn't able to get to some of these other pieces. There are other types of headaches, ones that are extracranial. Typically that is more tension-based. We see it happen with our physical posture that we take on, especially if we're working at workstations at a computer. We see this piece. Chiropractic is great for helping with this extracranial stress that we see, versus sometimes when we're talking about migraines, we need to go down the rabbit hole a little bit and do some investigative matters to really see, where is this coming from? Is there a chronic infection that we're worried about that's been going on? Maybe it's coming from the mouth. Maybe you were bit by a tick, at 9 years old, camping with your family, that may be coming from that, right? So typically migraines can take some investigative work to really evaluate where are these stress components coming from, versus if we see a tension or an extracranial type presentation of a headache, where we do see the structural component and the chiropractic piece really, going hand in hand with that one. So I apologize that I didn't get through all of those. But I wanted to make sure that we just sit with this information, right? Any symptom that we have, that is a flag. That is your body telling you something. And if it continues to tell you something more frequently with higher intensity, that's because you're not listening, right? And so we need to shift and change how we view health and what we choose to do with our health. And again, I'll go back to, if you are showing up for your chiropractic care, that is a major step. and it helps your reserve and your resiliency. And as you are more clearer in your head and better able to process, you can do more things, like, make time for your workouts, or choose more nutrient dense foods, or breathe better and maybe focus on your meditation. There's lots of things. So I hope that you found some, something that you could take away from this message and this workshop. And I look forward to hearing your takeaways in the office. So again, I am Dr. Miaken Zeigler of future Monarch Family Chiropractic with Dr. Kristen Zawada. And I cannot wait to meet all of you guys in the new space. So